again, everyone. First, I want to briefly thank everyone for the love I received on my last video, as it was my first YouTube video. I'm glad to know the message and research I did resonated with so many of you, and I'm excited to continue discussion about games. I still have some festering ideas about Bloober Team Silent Hill 2 that I would like to talk about though, so today I want to focus on two other characters of the game, Angela and Eddie, rather than solely on James, and give some insight on why they exist in his Silent Hill, rather than having their own isolated versions. Before we continue though, I do want to go ahead and let you know there will be spoilers in this video, so proceed with caution. Recently, I convinced my stepdad to buy the Silent Hill 2 remake, as he played the first game when it originally came out, and he wanted to return to the franchise. Of course, he loved the game mostly, but his biggest point of concern was around the side characters in the game. He asked me, what are they doing in Silent Hill? In James's Silent Hill? What are they adding to the story? And as defensive as I got, I truthfully couldn't answer his question more than giving him snippets of speculation and fan theories. So, here I am. I spent hours looking through various articles that seemed a bit interesting and related, but ultimately concluded that there's just not enough evidence or discussion surrounding this subject at all. So I turned to fan theories. A big shout out to both Callyxi and Very Cool Guy Mike for their videos that attempt to bridge this gap of understanding. As many of you may know, Angela is in Silent Hill for murdering her father and brother, who abused her, and is looking for her mother. Eddie is in Silent Hill, potentially running away or hiding from someone, and also possibly murdering someone. But he did murder a dog, so that's just as painful. I say possibly though, because I do take the creator's word for things, and Masahiro Ito said that Eddie did only murder a dog, but he shot a football player in the leg. However, there will always be theories. We all know why James is in Silent Hill, right? He murdered his wife. Moving on. Before we get started, I would like to state my own thoughts of Angela and Eddie's existence in Silent Hill. I kind of take everything for what it is the first time I play a game, and get really defensive of it when I like it. In this game, I didn't find myself initially questioning why Angela or Eddie existed here. I just figured they did, and that was that, considering paths have crossed in other installments of this franchise as well. But it's an ever-lingering question that I find lacks conversation. I saw a comment from someone a while ago somewhere on social media that expressed that Angela and Eddie exist in James's Silent Hill because they are doing something for his story. They further it, of course, as in literally progress the story, but they also help James grapple with emotions and events that have occurred. For example, by James killing Abstract Daddy, he is committing a selfless act and doing something that he doesn't have to in order to help someone out. He is helping Angela grapple with guilt, like Pyramid Head would essentially be doing with James, but also progressing her story as well, as Abstract Daddy has to be dead for her story to keep moving. With Eddie, James is a little bit harsher with him, initially refusing to go with Eddie, and based off of the remake, I believe James thinks that Eddie killed the guy in the fridge and doesn't want to be associated with a murderer. But also, James's interactions with Eddie are a little bit uncomfortable, and he's less physically involved with Eddie's story, unlike Angela, as he doesn't have to beat a monster for Eddie or to progress his story. Instead, he has to fight Eddie, as I would come to think that Eddie is his own worst enemy. Similar to James battling the two Pyramid Heads, or his guilt, or as some of you may say, himself. So, in a way, Eddie helps further James's realization of what he has done to his wife. Now it's time to suggest the YouTube videos I found discussing this. YouTuber Callyxi suggests that there's a connection between Angela, Eddie, and James because of their psychological states. They suggest that each time James comes across Angela or Eddie at that point is where James's head is. So, for example, in the graveyard, Angela says,
"This town, there's something wrong with it? And it's not just the fog either."
Is it dangerous?
Maybe.
And James responds,
No, I believe you. It's just... I guess I don't really care if it's dangerous or not.
Callyxi also suggests that Angela knows of the fate of James and is foreshadowing his future. And aside here, I believe this suggestion could go along with the time loop theory. Anyway, the evidence they gave is when Angela asks,
Are you afraid?
And James continues pressing Angela on her lack of knowing where exactly her mother would be. But James is quite literally in the same position as Angela. Callyxi reminds players that Eddie is in denial of his actions, even though he's aware of what he's done, but James is just in denial, so he doesn't remember doing anything to his wife. He continues explaining that Eddie does still desire to inflict pain upon others, and brings a key question to the forefront here. How far off is James from becoming Eddie? I find this question fascinating, as I think it would tie in nicely to the Maria ending, where I fully believe James is being selfish, and the ending suggests too that he hasn't learned from his actions and potentially will harm Maria as well. But that's a discussion for a whole other video. Callyxi suggests that self-awareness is the key difference between James and Eddie, which we don't have to get into the public versus private, cognitive, physical, and emotional types of self-awareness, but I see what they were going for here. James is a little bit more competent and aware of things going on, even if he's apathetic. Eddie is letting his emotions sort of dictate his time in Silent Hill, rather than learning from it or trying to move forward. He's festering in it and not doing anything about it. Even if Angela didn't fight Abstract Daddy, she still has been searching for her mother. Continuing, they suggest that if James felt no remorse for Mary or Maria's death, he would be more like Eddie, which I agree, but I still fully believe, similarly to my last video, that this ties into player psychology and what they think and feel about themselves and James, and still would lead into the Maria ending, because nobody learns anything. Their last note is that throughout James's journey, he maintains a sense of self, and has seen the dead ends that both Angela and Eddie took within their stories, and because of that, he essentially sits at the cusp of becoming one or the other at any given moment. However, I don't fully agree with this. I like the interpretation of them representing James's mental state, and that he could potentially be more like one or the other. But I would say that they more foreshadow the endings he can have, depending on the routes he and the players take. For example, it's known that Angela commits suicide, and James also commits suicide in the in-water ending. Eddie ends up dying ultimately at the hands of James, but I would say that Eddie didn't do anything to get better. He instead overcompensated with more and more violence, and in a way, James is overcompensating for murdering Mary by strictly replacing her in the Maria ending. I think Callyxi and I have some overlap in our thoughts though. In my last video, I attributed James's ending to how the players move through the game. However, now I am seeing how characters are hinting at endings as well. Some questions I posed in my last video were, do you see James as someone guilty who doesn't deserve a second chance? Maybe he gets the second chance with a replacement of his past lover, with a new, healthier person. Or maybe he deserves to start over, as he's paid his dues in Silent Hill and owned up to his mistakes. And I finished my last video off by saying, maybe you're also like me, and you've seen what could be, his death, and now what should be, redemption, for both James and yourself. However, Callyxi finishes their video saying, if James never met Angela or Eddie, he too would have been denied a chance at redemption. I like this a lot, and I think that in terms of characters, it works. But I don't think they fully help or hurt James's chance at redemption. They technically have fixed endings, as in, we can't change what happens to them, and James inevitably must run into them in the game. If they were removed, I do think James's character progression wouldn't be as obvious or fleshed out, so I think they help bring nuance and emotional depth and clarity to James and the players. However, I would say that that's what's happening. They're for player understanding, because I do think that everyone who comes to Silent Hill has a chance at redemption. It's just up to the player if they deserve it. To go with this, a fellow Silent Hill enjoyer, my friend and colleague, gamer buddy, #1 supporter, we'll call her Spicy, also gave me some thoughts about what she thought about Angela and Eddie's existence in Silent Hill, and I think she's leaning more towards Callyxi's thoughts about it. She reminded me of this horror musical she showed me once called The Devil's Carnival, in which the carnival is essentially a limbo, and there are 3 stories simultaneously happening within this carnival, or limbo. Each individual story acts as a cautionary tale, and the carnival is a place that these people ultimately end up in because of their actions. Or they're potentially called to it. However, they have to endure their time there and move through the motions. If the people learn their lesson, they can move on, or in my words, if they redeem themselves. However, if they do not learn their lesson, they are stuck there, in that limbo. She says that she sort of envisions the characters existing in Silent Hill similarly. The town calls each of them because they have something that they're grappling with, hence them existing in the space. However, when it comes to why they are there together, she explains that there's potential that they're acting as cautionary tales for each other. She does express how that might not be exactly it, or why exactly they're functioning in the same space, but maybe that Eddie's character is acting as a warning for James, etc., or potentially Eddie and James being two sides of the same coin. Which I find interesting in conversation with Callyxi's thoughts because of their suggestion that Angela and Eddie's characters are demonstrating what James could possibly become. So yes, cautionary tales if he does not change his ways or learn from his mistakes or from his time in Silent Hill. I also could tie this into the endings, as in the potential endings James could get if he's not careful or doesn't redeem himself, but I need to calm down a little bit with that, I think. This brings me to our next Silent Hill fan theory from previously mentioned YouTuber Very Cool Guy Mike. Now, as shocking and jaw-dropping as his thoughts initially seemed on Angela and Eddie's existence in James's Silent Hill, I actually really liked what he had to say. He said, James is Angela and Eddie's version of Pyramid Head. I paused the video out of shock when he said this, not because I disagree, but because I was upset that more people don't talk about how fascinating or viable this is. Now, he does stress that he doesn't literally mean that James is a pyramid head, but expresses that James does only seem to come along to, quote, torment them, unquote. Not literally, but he does find them in their times of vulnerability. He expresses that the men in Angela's family are terrible for abusing her, but that her mom is also a piece of shit for saying that Angela deserved it. Right on. He also says that, of course, James will ultimately be tormenting her, because a man is probably the last thing Angela wants to see or trust in this town. As for Eddie, he usually is stressed when James runs into him, also quite vulnerable. This makes sense to me because Pyramid Head also comes when James is vulnerable, and thinking about it, he's known to literally progress James's story, right? So I think this is another instance in which James is acting as a quote-unquote tormentor or pyramid head makes sense because he is also essentially progressing Angela and Eddie's stories. I'm thinking specifically when James kills Abstract Daddy for Angela so that she can literally move forward and keep looking for her mom. I could make arguments for Eddie's case as well, but I'll need to think on that a little bit more. Continuing, I'm going to call him Mike right now, but he also wanted to clarify why these characters matter to James's story. He says James can see the victimization of Mary in each of them, and his situation with Mary, but also parts of himself in them. Thinking about how James took care of Mary while she was sick, and then ultimately killing her to escape the situation, Mike explains that James is still finding himself in a similar situation by being surrounded by people who yell and lash out at him, and for making him feel bad for helping them. Think about Angela's lashing out at James soon after he kills Abstract Daddy. Then, of course, James is also being pushed and ultimately is forced to kill again. Thinking about Eddie's boss fight. But then he also says that James is forced to sit and let Angela go in her ending, and explains that these are just more reminders of things that has happened in James's life. But I really enjoy and agreed with a lot of Mike's perspective here. Now, really quickly, I do want to run through some comments on Mike's YouTube video that I think were interesting in this conversation and for this topic. Commenter Ray Despoir says, in a way, Mary died twice. Once when diagnosed with a terminal illness, and second when James actually put the pillow to her head. The death of Angela and Eddie mirror both of Mary's deaths. Angela could represent her first death. James couldn't do anything about Mary's disease, and likewise cannot do anything to save Angela from herself. A feeling of helplessness despite wanting to do something. Whereas with Eddie, James had a direct hand in killing him, just like Mary's second and actual death. James had to use force to stop Eddie. Realistically, James didn't need to kill Eddie, but could have walked away. I know the game doesn't let you progress. Like with Mary, he could have let her live her last remaining minutes, hours, days, but he chose to end it on his own terms. To me, this resonates with what Mike was saying a little bit about how the characters are reflecting things in James's life. But I also think it's interesting that their deaths would represent Mary's 2 deaths, and maybe how this can be thought of alongside the different endings the characters could potentially have, all kind of resonating with each other. Another commenter said, "Funny, I just read some thread on Reddit about Eddie and why the town summoned him. Someone on there mentioned that the reason the 3 of them meet is because they have this one commonality. They are murderers. Eddie killed his bully and the bully's dog, Angela committed both a patricide and a fratricide, and James killed his wife. They all answered Silent Hill's call for self-reflection and moving on from the past." And then just really quickly, for people who might not be familiar, a patricide is when somebody kills their father, and a fratricide is when somebody kills their brother or their sister. I would have worded this in layman terms just because some viewers might not know that Angela killed her brother. But yeah, that's just me, to each his own. We got a nice little vocabulary lesson in today, so yeah. Now back to the comment. I don't have too many thoughts on it. I just think that it works. Aside from speculation about Eddie's murdering, because as previously mentioned, Masahiro confirmed that Eddie hasn't killed anybody. So, I don't fully agree with the claim that Eddie murdered anybody either, but I do think the self-reflection is yet again another thing that Callyxi's video discusses a bit and is interesting to think about alongside the multiple endings that I think are worth conversation. The last commenter, Old and Sad, says, "I'm one of those who don't believe Silent Hill punishes anybody. For me, it makes zero sense considering James has so many paths, and one of them leads to clear and almost undeserved redemption, and another is endorsement of his previous wrongdoing. Also, James has specific and unique monsters exclusively dedicated to punishment. So, from my perspective, Silent Hill is kind of the opposite of punishment. It almost grants you wishes. The problem is, only broken people can get there, and broken people produce broken wishes. So, obviously, I can't agree with your theory, but it was a pleasure to listen to, and it's a fun angle to look at the story." I really like this commenter's take. I think it's quite fascinating. Granting wishes is interesting, especially considering the original Silent Hill 2 DLC, Born from a Wish. I'll save that for another video, though. Anyway, I pulled this comment because I think this person is hitting at something really interesting and contrasting. The town isn't forcing you to do anything. I like this, especially considering in my last video I discussed how important passive decisions you make are, but the town does let you sort of do and get what you want, according to the commenter, though what you want in terms of broken things and wishes. I do like their idea of undeserved redemption and endorsement of previous wrongdoing in terms of endings, but of course, I still think these are more up to the player. But keep in mind the thoughts about wishes. More on that soon. So, finally, what are Angela and Eddie doing in James's Silent Hill? Are they acting as psychological reflections of James? Are they demonstrating what James could ultimately become or succumb to in terms of endings? Are they serving as cautionary tales to one another or the player? Is James their version of Pyramid Head? Or are they purely there to add emotional depth to the story? Ultimately, as per usual, that's up for you to decide. I put a lot of pressure on endings, personally, rather than the full journey, but I do think it's interesting how each of these characters contribute to the overall story of the game. What would the game even be like without these characters? I think that after hearing these various perspectives, my original thoughts did lean a little towards Mike's suggestion of James acting as a sort of pyramid head for each character, but I also really like the idea of each existing within the space as a warning or potential direction any and each of the characters could go, besides Laura, of course. But maybe that's just it. James's pyramid head forces him to push through and gets him to one place after another, and carries a lot of James's guilt throughout his time there. there's absolutely a possibility that James is carrying some guilt for Angela and Eddie as well. As James appears a little worn during and after Abstract Daddy's fight, and even seems a little sympathetic towards Eddie, especially in the prison and before Eddie blows up on James right before their fight. Regardless, I think there needs to be more stimulating conversation about this, as it's a point significantly overlooked in comparison to others about monsters and lore that people have fleshed out, or that we have gotten confirmed by Masahiro Ito himself. I hope that you've learned something from this, and can take away fun theories or new suggestions to ponder about Angela and Eddie's characters. Maybe they had their chance at redemption, but failed at it. Maybe they succumbed to James's version of Pyramid Head, or needed his help too much, refusing to fight him or dying to him, contrasting James's Pyramid Heads as he fought them both off until they sacrificed themselves. Or maybe they refuse to acknowledge what they've done, and therefore are living fully in denial, unable to move forward because they think they're completely justified in whatever. Which, to be fair, I don't blame Angela for any of her actions, but I do think that acknowledging what each of them have done and then forgiving themselves could have helped them get their redemption, just like James. Maybe someday they all get their leave ending. Maybe they deserve a little bit more sympathy from James, or even you, especially you as a player. All I know is that it's just a theory. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, see you guys in the next one.